Amidst the Olympics on August 12, 2006, the world recoiled in shock as the bodies of 3 athletes were found decapitated in the Olympic village where athletes were housed. The Italian coach Marco Rossi was discovered barely alive after his car was found teetering on the edge of a bridge. The police saved him from the frigid waters below and opened fire on a mysterious assailant. Coach Rossi was in a state of shock and his skin was covered in second-degree burns. He was rushed to the hospital, where he spent several sleepless nights haunted by nightmares. Once deemed mentally and physically fit, he unraveled a story so harrowing it would be whispered about in hushed tones long after the Olympic Games had ended. The following is Coach Marco Rossi's account of the events translated to English. I still vividly remember the day I first met Eric Di Luca at the 2002 Olympics. He was a raw talent, brimming with potential, but it was a devastating blow to his spirit when he finished last in the 200-meter sprint. Eric was shattered. I remember him sitting alone in the locker room, his head in his hands, as the world celebrated its new champions. I knew then that the weight of failure would follow him for a long time. For the next few years, no one heard of Eric or knew about his whereabouts. I assumed he quit, but he lingered in the back of my mind. Shortly before we finalized our athletics team for the 2006 Olympics, I was surprised to see Eric's name on the roster. When I saw him, I asked him where he had been for the past 4 years. He never gave a clear answer, but I overheard other athletes teasing him about some mysterious visit to the Himalayas in India. I was curious about that and the fact that Eric was in the best shape of his life. Whenever I poked around inquiring, he would evade the topic or give conflicting stories that never added up. Other coaches didn't care much because he was slated to win a sure-shot gold at the Olympics. This was a new version of Eric, who surpassed his own capabilities. He was stronger, faster, and disturbingly calm. At times it felt like he was hardly breaking a sweat. While the other athletes looked deadbeat by the end of the day, Eric appeared unaffected. I can't remember if I ever saw him resting or sleeping, yet he never looked tired. It was during the qualifiers that I first noticed something truly disturbing. When I first met Eric, he was a calm, shy boy who didn't speak much. But this new Eric had changed. His behavior was erratic, bordering on violent. One evening, when Eric and his teammates were hanging out, he began behaving rather unusually, almost as if something primal had taken hold of him. He was putting on a spectacle by leaping over cars, laughing maniacally, as if challenging the very limits of human ability. A local bartender, annoyed by his antics, confronted him. Eric's response was shocking. He spat in the man's face. The bartender, a burly man with fists like hammers, swung at Eric. His punch landed hard against Eric's jaw, sending him stumbling backward into a street pole. I saw the flash of blood at the corner of Eric's mouth, sharp and metallic, before something in him snapped. Eric lunged at the man, his fist connecting with the bartender's ribs with a sickening crunch. The sound echoed through the street like a death knell. They grappled, a flurry of fists and snarls, Eric's eyes wide with a wild fury I had never seen before. He wasn't fighting like an athlete, he was fighting like an animal, consumed by a primal urge to destroy. His fists rained down on the bartender in a brutal, uncontrolled fury, and it took everything we had to pry him off. I could see the madness in his eyes, a burning rage that seemed almost inhuman. After that night, my curiosity got the better of me. I began spying on Eric, hoping to uncover what was fueling his violent outbursts. One night, I found him in his room, drenched in sweat, mumbling incoherently. His eyes were wide and unfocused, the pupils dilated as if he was seeing something not of this world. The sight of him slumped on the floor, trembling, sent a chill down my spine. I didn't want to believe that Eric was taking drugs, but it was the only explanation that made sense. Determined to find out the truth, I broke into his room one night when he was out. What I discovered left me breathless. A collection of ancient texts and vials filled with herbs scattered across his desk. The texts were written in a language I couldn't decipher, filled with cryptic symbols and strange drawings that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Could Eric be using these herbs to enhance his performance? I wondered. I picked up a speck of the herb from the table and sniffed it. Almost immediately, a burning sensation spread across my fingertips. My heart began to race, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if I was on the brink of a panic attack. I knew then that these herbs were not just for enhancing performance. They were something far more sinister. The next day, I scheduled a drug test for the entire team. The results were shocking, not because Eric tested positive, but because he didn't. Another athlete, our javelin thrower, was the one using performance-enhancing drugs, but Eric's results came back clean. I couldn't believe it. How could someone with Eric's behavior not have anything unusual in his system? As I was on the phone with the lab, trying to make sense of the results, I felt a sudden cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned around and there was Eric, standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on me with a cold, emotionless stare. "What do you want, Eric?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric said nothing, just stood there, his gaze piercing through me. I quickly gathered my things and left the office, my heart pounding in my chest. When I glanced back, Eric was gone. My office was at the end of a long hallway, and yet he had vanished without a sound. It was as if he had never been there at all. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up past 2 a.m., my mind racing with thoughts of Eric. When I finally drifted off, I was awoken by a sudden chill in the air. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves, though the window was shut tight when I had gone to bed. I opened my eyes to find the window wide open, the curtains billowing in the cold night breeze. I sat up in bed, straining my eyes in the darkness. As I reached for my glasses on the side table, I froze in terror. There, standing in the shadows behind the lamp, was a figure, a tall, dark silhouette that seemed to blend into the darkness. "Eric?" I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, looming over me like a dark omen. I couldn't be sure if it was really there or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but the air felt thick with menace. I hesitated, my hand hovering over my glasses, unsure if I should make a move. But as soon as I started to reach for them, the figure shifted, taking a step forward. I gasped, the sound escaping my lips before I could stop it. The figure moved toward the window with an eerie, unnatural grace. Its footsteps made no sound, as if it was gliding on air. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt paralyzed with fear. It had to be Eric, but something about him was wrong. "Eric, please, can we talk?" My voice was barely audible. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it climbed out the window with a fluid, almost inhuman motion. I scrambled to turn on the light, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the switch. When I finally flicked it on, the room was empty, the window still open, the curtains swaying gently in the breeze. My room was on the 9th floor. There was no way anyone could have climbed out of that window and survived the fall. The next morning, Eric was on the field with all the other athletes, acting as if nothing had happened. But there was something different about him. His skin had a strange grayish hue, almost as if the life was slowly draining out of him. I tried to address the athletes as usual, but my mind was clouded with fear and confusion. Eric never looked me in the eye, and when I asked if anyone had any questions, he responded with the same eerie calmness as before, almost as if he was mocking me. A violent thunderstorm rolled in the night before the finals of Eric's event, the 200-meter sprint, casting an eerie shadow over the games. The event was postponed, and it was then that Eric's aggression began to surface in full force. I spotted him in the back of the stadium, getting into a heated altercation with another athlete from Belgium. I rushed over to break up the fight, but what I saw made my blood run cold. Eric's eyes were wild, almost animalistic, as he snarled at the other athlete, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I pulled him aside, trying to calm him down. "Eric, what's going on? You need to focus. The finals are tomorrow." But Eric didn't seem to hear me. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving with barely contained rage. "I have to win!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty stadium. I tried to reason with him, but he pushed me away with a strength that was almost inhuman. The other athlete backed off, terrified, as I led Eric to the locker room. His aggression was escalating, and I feared what might happen if he didn't get it under control. Later that night, I decided to take a drive, hoping to clear my mind. But as I returned to the village, I saw flashing lights and heard the distant wail of sirens. My heart sank as I sped toward the commotion, fearing the worst. When I arrived, I was met with a scene of chaos. Police cars and ambulances surrounded the building, and the area was cordoned off. I pushed my way through the crowd, my mind racing. 2 athletes had been found dead, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. The sight of their blood-stained tracksuits made my stomach turn. The police wouldn't give me any details, but I knew deep down that Eric was involved. I pushed open the door to Eric's room, and the sight before me was both terrifying and heartbreaking. Eric was on the floor, writhing in pain, his muscles contorting in ways that defied nature. His skin was slick with sweat, veins bulging as if they were trying to escape his body. In his trembling hands, he clutched two bottles, one filled with a golden liquid, the other with a green liquid. "Coach, help me," he said with his pleading eyes now welling up with tears. His eyes, wild and desperate, darted between the two bottles. For a fleeting moment, his gaze lingered on the green liquid. I saw something in his eyes, a glimmer of doubt, perhaps a hint of fear. But the moment passed. "I have to win," Eric growled, his voice distorted, as if multiple voices were speaking through him. He let the green bottle slip from his fingers, and it fell to the floor with a dull thud, rolling a few inches away. His fingers finally uncorked the bottle, and the golden liquid began to bubble and fizz. I tried to grab the bottle from him, but he lashed out, throwing me across the room with a strength I couldn't comprehend. I crashed into the wall, the wind knocked out of me. As I struggled to get up, Eric's body began to convulse violently. His skin started to ripple, stretching and tearing as something monstrous fought to break free from within. "Eric, stop! You're killing yourself!" I shouted, but he was beyond reason. With a final scream of, "I have to win," he downed the contents of the bottle in one gulp. His body shuddered violently, and for a moment, I thought he was going to explode. But instead, he pushed past me and burst out of the room, leaving a trail of destruction. I scrambled to my feet, was about to follow him when I noticed the green liquid. In a panic, I realized this might be the antidote, the only thing that could stop Eric's transformation. I rushed out of the building and jumped into my car, driving through the pouring rain, following the distant sound of Eric's screams. As I sped through the dark, empty streets, I saw a shadowy figure running at an impossible speed, darting between trees and buildings with a grace that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that Eric was no longer human. He was something else, something monstrous. I floored the gas pedal, trying to keep up with him, but it was no use. Eric was faster than any human could ever be. My car was barely holding together as I swerved around corners, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Suddenly, I felt a tremendous impact on the roof of the car, the metal buckling under the force. The car swerved out of control, the tires screeching as I fought to regain control. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of Eric, or what used to be Eric, clinging to the roof, his body twisted and deformed, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Before I could react, Eric's clawed hand smashed through the rear window, reaching for me with fingers that looked more like talons. I screamed and jerked the steering wheel to the right, sending the car careening off the road. The car crashed into the side of a bridge, the impact jolting me forward as the windshield shattered. I blacked out after the crash, the world around me fading into darkness. When I came to, my head was throbbing and everything was a blur. I could barely make out the sound of familiar panicked voices calling my name. As my vision slowly cleared, I recognized Stephen and Peter, two of my athletes, leaning over me. The icy wind whipped through the broken car window, and I realized my car was teetering dangerously over the edge of the bridge, above the freezing river below. "Coach, we have to get you out!" Stephen shouted, his voice trembling with urgency. I groaned in pain as I reached out, and Stephen grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the shattered door. Peter reached in from the other side, trying to steady the car. Thank you," I muttered, gasping for breath, my body still in shock. But as soon as the words left my mouth, a shadow loomed over us. Before we could react, a large hand shot out from the darkness and grabbed Peter by the throat. It was Eric, or what was left of him. His body had grown grotesque, muscles bulging unnaturally, veins pulsating with a sickening intensity beneath his skin. His eyes were no longer human, but wild, animalistic, glowing with a predatory hunger. Peter choked, his hands clawing desperately at the monstrous hand around his neck. Steam rose from where Eric's grip burned into Peter's flesh, the smell of charred skin filling the air. Stephen tried to intervene, but Eric was too fast. With a sickening crunch, Eric's other hand shot out and grabbed Stephen by the head. In one swift, brutal motion, he twisted Stephen's neck with such force that his head almost came clean off, the sound of snapping bones echoing in the cold night air. Blood sprayed across the icy pavement as Stephen's lifeless body crumpled to the ground. Peter's struggles grew weaker as Eric tightened his grip, his nails digging deep into Peter's throat. With a savage snarl, Eric lifted Peter off the ground, the veins in his arm bulging grotesquely as he crushed the life out of him. By now, Peter was eerily silent, wisps of smoke still curling from the seared flesh on his neck. Eric's monstrous form loomed closer, his eyes fixed on me with a terrifying intensity. He dragged Peter's limp body with him, each step heavy and deliberate. As he reached my car, he paused for a moment, staring through the window, almost as if savoring my terror. Then, with a savage roar, he smashed Peter's face through the glass, sending shards flying. I was paralyzed, my mouth open in a silent scream that refused to come. Peter's head hung grotesquely inside the car, blood pouring from his shattered face, flooding the floor beneath me. The sight was beyond horrifying, but my eyes were drawn to something else, the bottle with the green liquid, lying just within reach. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a surge of desperate energy, I grabbed the bottle and flung it at Eric. The liquid splashed across his chest, and almost instantly, he howled in agony. Steam erupted from his skin, his flesh sizzling as if burning from the inside out. He threw Peter's body aside like a rag doll, his fury turning into something primal, almost feral. Eric tore the car door clean off, the metal screeching as he ripped it away. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, his voice a guttural growl screaming,
"It's too late."
Just as his hand reached for me, a series of gunshots rang out. Eric convulsed, his body writhing in pain as the bullets tore into him. His skin bubbled and hissed, and with a final tortured scream, he dissolved into thin air, disappearing as if he had never existed. In the aftermath, I was dimly aware of policemen rushing toward me, their guns still smoking. They pulled me from the wreckage, but my eyes were glued to the ground, where the bodies of my two athletes lay crumpled and broken. Blood pooled around them, their features unrecognizable, mangled beyond recognition. I stared, unable to process the horror of what I was seeing, as a cold numbness took hold. The police confirmed that they had fired multiple rounds at a large figure by the car that night. But despite extensive searches, no body was ever recovered. Only charred remains and scraps of flesh were found near the scene, and none of them could be identified as human. Coach Marco Rossi retired shortly after the incident, his mind scarred by the horror he had witnessed. He was never the same after that night, haunted by visions of the monstrous figure that had once been Eric Di Luca. The forest, where Eric vanished, remained silent, save for the occasional sound of something large moving through the shadows, something that was once human. Please like and subscribe for more horror, scary stories.